There is a quiet kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from working too hard, but from running in place. In the same city, under the same sky, two lives unfold. One belongs to the accumulator of appearances. Every morning begins with urgency, a buzzing phone, a crowded schedule, a silent pressure to keep up. The paycheck is respectable. On paper, everything should be fine. And yet, at the end of every month, something feels missing, not dramatically, just enough to whisper, almost enough, but never quite there. The other life belongs to the keeper of enough. Nothing extraordinary at first glance, no sudden windfalls, no dramatic leaps, but there is a strange calm. Bills are paid, savings grow quietly, decisions feel lighter. There's space, not just in the wallet, but in the mind. The difference isn't visible in their income. It's buried in the invisible rules they follow when no one is watching. Most people never notice when the drift begins. It doesn't arrive like a storm. It feels more like a slow expansion. A slightly better apartment, a slightly nicer car, a few more subscriptions that seem harmless. Each decision feels justified in isolation. Together, they form a pattern that quietly consumes the future. We often tell ourselves that more income will fix everything, that the next raise, the next opportunity, the next breakthrough will finally bring relief. But something strange happens instead. Income rises, and so do expectations. Comfort becomes baseline. Baseline becomes pressure. Pressure becomes the new normal. And without realizing it, we begin buying things we don't need with money we haven't fully secured to maintain a version of life that was never truly ours. This is where the first fracture appears, not in the bank account, but in awareness. Because money problems rarely begin with numbers, they begin with habits that feel too small to question. A purchase made to ease a long day, a subscription kept just in case, a debt justified as temporary. Individually, they are harmless. Repeated daily, they become architecture. There is a form of debt that is louder than others. High interest, obvious, painful. It announces itself with urgency. It demands attention. And yet, even that isn't the most dangerous part. The real danger lies in the silent agreement we make with it. A silent trade, present comfort for future constraint. Paying 20% interest while hoping to build 10% growth elsewhere is not a moral failure. It's a mathematical leak, a system where effort is constantly canceled out before it can compound. And still, we tolerate it, because the alternative requires something uncomfortable, interruption. Not just of spending, but of identity. To stop is to question everything, the routines, the priorities, even the image we've built around ourselves. So instead, we continue, scrolling in the morning before thinking, reacting before deciding, filling time before understanding it. Days become reactive, decisions become automatic, money follows the same pattern, and somewhere in that cycle, something essential disappears: clarity. Without clarity, every choice feels urgent, every desire feels justified, every distraction feels necessary. This is how a life becomes full, yet strangely empty, not because there isn't enough money, but because there isn't enough intention. The truth is unsettling. We don't lose money in big, dramatic moments. We lose it quietly, in patterns that never pause long enough to be examined. And if those patterns remain untouched, more income won't create freedom. It will simply fund a more expensive version of the same trap. So the real question isn't how much is being earned. It's something far more uncomfortable. What invisible rules are being followed every single day without ever being chosen? The shift rarely begins with motivation. It begins with a small, almost invisible pause. Not a dramatic decision, not a life-changing event, just a moment where the pattern hesitates. A notification appears and is ignored. A purchase impulse rises and is written down instead. A morning begins without reaching for the phone. These moments feel insignificant, but they are not. They are the first signs of the observer, a version of the self that steps outside the loop, just long enough to notice it. And once something is noticed, it can no longer remain invisible. This is where minimalism quietly enters the story, not as restriction, but as precision, not about removing joy, but about removing interference. Because most financial stress is not created by lack, but by excess that was never questioned. Too many decisions, too many commitments, too many small leaks disguised as normal behavior. Each one drains attention, each one fragments focus, and when focus is scattered, money follows. We often believe discipline means doing more, but in reality, it begins with doing less, deliberately. Fewer accounts to manage, fewer purchases to justify, fewer distractions competing for attention. Simplicity is not aesthetic, it is functional clarity. When everything becomes visible, control returns almost naturally. A single account reveals where money actually flows. A planned purchase reveals whether desire survives time. A structured morning reveals how much energy was previously lost to chaos. These are not dramatic changes, but repeated daily, they begin to compound. There is a principle hidden beneath all of this, one that most people overlook. Money does not grow in complexity, it grows in clarity. The simpler the system, the fewer places it can leak. The fewer decisions required, the more energy remains for decisions that matter. And slowly, something unexpected begins to happen. Spending becomes quieter, not forced, not restricted, just less reactive. Desires that once felt urgent begin to fade when given time. A list of wants left untouched for 30 days starts to look unfamiliar, as if it belonged to someone else. Because in a way, it did. It belonged to a version driven by impulse, not intention. And as that version weakens, another one strengthens. A version that doesn't ask, can this be afforded right now? But instead asks, does this serve what actually matters? This is where priorities begin to emerge, not as a long list of ambitions, but as a narrow path, 3 directions at most. Anything beyond that becomes noise. And for the first time, there is a sense of alignment. Daily actions connect to long-term outcomes. Time is scheduled, not spent. Energy is protected, not depleted. Even rest changes form. It is no longer escape, but recovery. Because a rested mind doesn't just feel better, it decides better. And better decisions repeated over time reshape everything. This is the quiet turning point. Not a sudden transformation, but a gradual withdrawal from everything that once felt necessary, but was never truly essential. The clutter fades, the noise lowers, the system simplifies, and in that space, something begins to grow, not dramatically, but consistently. So the question is no longer about earning more or cutting everything. It becomes something far more precise. What would remain if everything unnecessary was finally removed? There is a stage where life no longer feels heavy, but also not yet free. It is a strange middle ground where the noise has been reduced, but the structure is still fragile. This is where the builder of systems begins to take shape, not through ambition, but through alignment. Because once the unnecessary has been removed, what remains is no longer chaotic. It becomes visible, and what is visible can be shaped. We often think wealth is built through effort, but effort without structure dissolves quickly. Money comes in, money goes out, and nothing stays long enough to grow. So the shift becomes subtle, not working harder, but designing better. A single account becomes the center of gravity. Money flows in and is immediately directed with intention. Savings are no longer a leftover, they are a priority. Automation replaces willpower. Because willpower fades, systems don't. There is something almost invisible happening here, a quiet reprogramming of behavior. Decisions are no longer made in moments of emotion, but pre-decided in moments of clarity. Bills are paid before they are felt. Savings grow before they are noticed. Spending becomes what remains, not what leads. And in that reversal, everything changes. Time begins to feel different too. It is no longer something that slips away unnoticed. It becomes something scheduled, protected, shaped. The calendar is no longer a list of obligations, but a reflection of values. Hours are blocked for thinking. Moments are reserved for growth. Silence is no longer empty, it becomes productive. Because wealth is not built in chaos, it is built in focus, and focus requires protection. This is where another quiet truth reveals itself. Energy is currency, not metaphorically, but literally. A tired mind spends more, a distracted mind reacts more, an overwhelmed mind escapes more, and each of those states leaks money in ways that cannot be tracked. So the builder begins to protect something deeper than income. Sleep becomes non-negotiable, rest becomes intentional, distractions are reduced, not out of discipline, but out of necessity, because clarity is expensive to lose. And once it is protected, something rare begins to appear: consistency. Not dramatic action, not bursts of motivation, just quiet, repeated behavior that compounds without attention. Checking finances once a week, reviewing goals once a month, adjusting direction without panic. This is where minimalism reveals its true nature. It is not about having less, it is about having fewer things competing for what matters. And in that reduction, the signal becomes stronger. Spending aligns with purpose. Time aligns with priorities. Energy aligns with outcomes. Even relationships begin to shift. There is less tolerance for conversations that drain, less interest in appearances that cost too much, less need to explain choices that no longer require validation. Because when the system is clear, external noise loses its influence. And slowly, a new identity stabilizes, not defined by income, not defined by possessions, but by control. Control over direction, control over attention, control over what is allowed to stay and what is quietly removed. This is where wealth stops feeling like a goal and starts feeling like a byproduct. But there is still one final layer, because even the strongest system, if left untouched, begins to drift. And drift, if unnoticed, always returns to chaos. So the question becomes quieter but sharper. If everything now feels under control, what ensures it stays that way when life inevitably changes? Control creates stability, but stability can quietly become attachment. And attachment, if left unexamined, becomes weight. This is where the one who lets go begins to emerge. Not as loss, but as refinement. Because even in a well-structured life, excess has a way of returning. Not all at once, but slowly. A new subscription here, an unused commitment there, an object kept just because. Each one feels small, but together they begin to blur the clarity that was once so sharp. And clarity, once diluted, is difficult to recover. So the practice becomes continuous, not building, but editing, looking at everything, not emotionally, but functionally. What still serves? What quietly drains? And the answers are rarely comfortable, because many things we hold on to were never chosen intentionally, they were inherited. From past decisions, from old identities, from moments that no longer exist. There is a subtle illusion that keeps them in place. The belief that letting go erases meaning, but meaning was never in the object, it was in the moment, and the moment has already passed. So holding on does not preserve it, it only extends its weight into the present. This applies to money as well. There are financial decisions we hesitate to undo, a membership that no longer fits, an investment made out of pride, a path chosen too early and held for too long. Not because they still serve, but because letting go feels like admitting something. But what if the real cost is not the mistake, but the refusal to move beyond it? There is a concept rarely spoken out loud. Sunk costs are not just financial, they are psychological anchors. And until they are cut, movement remains limited. So the one who lets go begins to act differently. Decisions are no longer based on the past, but on the present. Subscriptions are canceled without hesitation. Unused items are removed without guilt. Commitments are declined without explanation. not out of coldness, but out of clarity. Because every yes carries a cost: time, energy, attention, money. And when those are limited, each one must be spent with precision. Even technology begins to shift its role. No longer a default environment, but a controlled tool. Notifications are silenced, apps are removed, information is filtered. Because attention is not infinite, and wherever attention goes, money tends to follow. Less scrolling leads to fewer impulses lead to fewer leaks lead to more control. The system becomes lighter, not because there is less, but because nothing unnecessary remains. And in that lightness, something unexpected appears: space. Space to think, space to choose, space to breathe without pressure. This is where life stops feeling reactive and starts feeling intentional. But even here, there is a final illusion: the belief that once simplicity is achieved, it will remain. It won't. Because life changes, circumstances shift, priorities evolve, and without awareness, complexity always finds its way back in. So the final discipline is not about achieving minimalism, it is about maintaining it, quietly, consistently, without announcement, without resistance, just a continuous return to what matters and a quiet removal of everything that doesn't. And that leads to one final realization: if nothing is permanent, then what truly defines a life that remains free over time? There is no final destination, no moment where everything locks into place and remains untouched. Only a quiet rhythm: build, refine, release, return. This is where the one who understands enough begins to live, not as a goal achieved, but as a way of moving through life. Because over time, something subtle becomes clear. Freedom was never about having more. It was about needing less without feeling deprived. And that difference changes everything. Money is no longer chased, it is managed. Decisions are no longer reactive, they are aligned. Time is no longer filled, it is chosen. And in that shift, a different kind of wealth begins to emerge. Not visible, not loud, but deeply stable. Savings grow, not through intensity, but through consistency. Expenses remain controlled, not through restriction, but through clarity. Life feels lighter, not because it is easy, but because it is intentional. There is no longer a need to prove anything, not through possessions, not through income, not through comparison. Because comparison itself begins to fade, it loses relevance in a life that is no longer externally defined. Instead, a different metric appears: peace. Not the absence of problems, but the absence of unnecessary pressure. Bills are predictable, choices are deliberate, mistakes are corrected quickly, without attachment. Even ambition changes form. It becomes narrower, more precise, less about doing everything, more about doing what matters deeply. 3 priorities, no more. Each one connected to a direction that actually leads somewhere, and everything else becomes optional. There is a quiet confidence in this stage, not loud, not declared, just present, a knowing that whatever changes, the system can adapt, because the foundation is no longer built on effort alone, it is built on awareness, and awareness does not disappear. Every 6 months, there is a pause, not forced, just natural, a moment to step back and look again. What has returned that no longer serves? What has shifted without being noticed? And gently, without resistance, it is adjusted. Not dramatically, just enough to stay aligned. This is how drift is prevented, not through control, but through attention. And attention, when consistent, becomes protection. Over time, something almost invisible happens. Money stops being the center. It becomes a tool, a quiet one, supporting life, not defining it. And in that quiet, a realization settles in. The life once imagined as someday is no longer distant. It is here, not perfect, not complete, but sufficient. And perhaps that was the missing piece all along, not the need to earn more, not the need to optimize everything, but the ability to recognize when enough has already been reached.